A tense flight scene begins with open racism. A white police officer humiliates and drags a black passenger off the plane. The crowd watches in uneasy silence, some recording on their phones. But the veteran passenger's calm dignity unsettles the cop. A symbolic gesture sets the tone for a coming storm, ending on a chilling cliffhanger. "We don't want people like you on this plane. Get up, now!" The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Passengers froze, their in-flight chatter dissolving into uncomfortable silence. Every eye tilted toward the center aisle where a tall, broad-shouldered police officer stood, his voice sharp, dripping with disdain. His uniform was crisp, badge gleaming beneath the sterile cabin lights, his jaw clenched, radiating authority and arrogance. The officer's hand gripped the headrest in front of him, as if the plane belonged to him. His boots thudded against the carpeted floor with every slight shift, making the cramped space feel even smaller. Children peeked over seats. Parents pulled them back, whispering "shh," while phones quietly clicked into record mode. The cabin was now a stage, the officer the villain in plain sight. At the center of it all sat a black man, quiet, steady, unmoved by the storm surrounding him. He wasn't young. His hair bore silver strands, his posture upright but weary, like someone who had stood at attention one too many times in his life. His coat was simple, his bag tucked neatly beneath his seat. He blinked once at the officer's words, but his face betrayed neither anger nor fear. Passengers exchanged glances. Some frowned in silent protest. Others looked away, pretending not to see. A woman in the back muttered, "This is wrong," but her voice drowned beneath the officer's bark. "I said, on your feet." The cop's tone rose, echoing down the cabin walls. His arrogance wasn't just in his voice. It was in the way he loomed over the man, in the casual way his hand rested near his belt, fingers brushing the holster as though a simple passenger demanded force. The black man did not move. His calm presence felt heavier than the officer's rage. He placed a hand on the armrest, fingers steady, as if to anchor himself. His other hand held a small, worn leather wallet on his lap. The edges were frayed, but it had clearly been cared for. He did not open it. He simply rested it there like an unspoken reminder of something greater. The officer scoffed. "You think that's going to save you?" "Not today." With a sudden yank, he grabbed the man's arm and pulled. The cabin gasped in unison. A child cried out, "Stop hurting him!" before being hushed. Shoes scuffled against the floor as passengers shifted. Some instinctively reaching for their phones, others shrinking back in fear of authority. Dragged into the narrow aisle, the man stumbled but did not resist. His dignity seemed to echo louder than the officer's insults. "You don't belong here. You never will," the officer sneered, his voice low enough to sting, but loud enough for everyone to hear. A sharp, symbolic moment followed. The officer slapped the wallet from the man's hand, sending it skidding across the aisle. It landed near a passenger's foot, flipping open just enough for a flash of polished metal to gleam under the harsh overhead lights. The passenger's eyes widened, but the officer didn't notice, too consumed by his performance of power. The man, though dragged forward, straightened his spine. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the tense air. "You may drag me from this seat," he said, his tone steady, every word deliberate. "But you will not drag the truth." The officer shoved him harder, tugging at his jacket. "Save your speeches. No one cares." But the silence of the cabin told a different story. Dozens of eyes cared. Phones captured, hearts pounded, breaths held. As the officer reached the front of the plane, pushing the man toward the exit, the wallet lay abandoned behind. The metal inside glimmered again, waiting to be noticed. Passengers looked from the wallet to the man, then back to their screens. Something was wrong, something far bigger than an unruly passenger. And then came the line, the one that shifted the air entirely. The man turned his head slightly, catching the officer's eye. "One day this badge you hide behind will mean less than nothing," the officer snorted, yanking open the door as the jet bridge hissed with recycled air. "We'll see about that." But the audience of passengers already had their proof. Their videos captured every shove, every insult, every flicker of dignity against arrogance. The cliffhanger hovered, electric in the cabin. What exactly had been in that wallet? And why had the glint of metal stirred such silent awe? The officer had no idea, but soon the whole world would. The air inside the plane felt heavier than the recycled oxygen being pumped through its vents. The confrontation at the boarding gate still lingered like a poisonous fog. Even as the officer adjusted himself in his seat, passengers couldn't erase the image of him dragging the black man by his arm, barking orders like the man was a criminal instead of a paying passenger. Whispers carried across the narrow cabin. "Did you see that?" Unbelievable, in front of everyone. He didn't even fight back. The black man, still silent, sat by the window in row 17. His hands rested calmly on his lap, fingers interlaced, his profile etched in the glow of the late afternoon sun spilling through the oval glass. He didn't look at anyone, not the flight attendants who avoided his eyes, not the passengers pretending to read magazines, and certainly not the officer who sat 3 rows ahead, chest puffed with false pride. The badge on the officer's chest glimmered under the cabin lights. For him, it wasn't just a badge. It was armor, a license to move unchecked. He reclined back in his seat, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to question what had just happened. The black man exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly against the cold pane of glass. Inside his chest, anger pulsed like a restrained storm, but on the outside, he radiated composure. That composure cut deeper than any words. The flight attendants continued their safety demonstration, their voices clipped, trembling just slightly. One attendant, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated when her gaze fell on the black man. For a moment, her lips pressed together, as though she wanted to apologize, to acknowledge the injustice. But training and fear stitched her mouth shut. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed overhead, too calm for the storm beneath. "We'll be taking off shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." The plane began to taxi. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the murmurs. Yet silence grew heavier. Every few seconds, eyes flicked toward row 17, then darted away. It wasn't curiosity. It was conscience gnawing at them. The officer leaned over to the man sitting next to him, another passenger forced by chance into his company. "Had to set an example," the officer muttered, loud enough for 2 rows to hear. "These people think they can do whatever they want. Not on my watch." The words slashed the air. A woman across the aisle gasped softly. A man in the back shifted in his seat, restless. Yet no one spoke. No one challenged him. The silence of witnesses, familiar, suffocating, wrapped tighter around the black man's shoulders. He finally turned his head, just slightly, eyes steady on the back of the officer's seat. Not a glare, not even defiance, just a stillness, a presence that refused to shrink. That silent look traveled through the cabin like an unspoken sentence. Some passengers felt shame burn their cheeks. Others looked down, fiddling with seatbelts. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, the world below shrinking into a tapestry of roads and rivers, the black man whispered under his breath. Words meant for himself, yet strong enough to ripple through the moment. "They think they own the air too." The cabin tilted into climbing silence. Outside, the horizon burned orange with the setting sun, casting long shadows across every face inside the plane. Shadows of arrogance, shadows of guilt, shadows of dignity unbroken. The officer shifted uncomfortably now, though he wouldn't admit it. He tugged at his collar, eyes darting for a moment toward the reflection in the window. In that reflection, his badge glared back at him, but so did his own smirk, suddenly hollow, suddenly smaller. The man in row 17 closed his eyes. He wasn't retreating. He was gathering. The storm within him was patient. And in that suspended cabin 30,000 feet above the earth, every passenger felt it without knowing why. Something was about to shatter. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled into cruising altitude. A faint chime signaled the release of seatbelts, and flight attendants rolled carts into the narrow aisles, the clinking of plastic cups and soda cans echoing louder than words dared to. But whispers traveled faster than the cart. "I can't believe he did that," a woman near the back whispered to her husband. "He's an officer. He has the right." The man muttered back, though his voice lacked conviction. Right to humiliate someone? 2 rows ahead, a young college student tapped nervously at his phone, trying to type what he had witnessed into a note before memory blurred it. He glanced up at the black man in row 17, who still sat still, hands folded, gaze fixed on nothing. The stillness made his heart ache. A pair of businessmen argued softly across the aisle. "You saw how calm he was," one said. "Didn't resist. Didn't shout. Nothing." "Exactly," the other replied. "That tells me something's off. If he wasn't guilty, why stay so quiet?" The first man frowned. Or maybe he's just tired. Tired of fighting every day. The words hit the air like stones on water, rippling outward. The officer, seated in row 14, caught fragments of these whispers. His jaw tightened. He leaned back further, stretching his arm arrogantly across the armrest, as though he owned not just his row, but the entire plane. "People need order," he muttered again, louder this time, his voice slicing into the hushed atmosphere. "Without authority, chaos runs wild. Some of you wouldn't even be safe if it weren't for people like me." The words landed like nails. Some passengers turned away, pretending not to hear. Others stole glances at the black man, expecting some reaction, some rebuttal. But he didn't move. That calm was unbearable. The officer shifted, finally craning his neck just enough to glare down the aisle at him. "You got something to say?" He barked, voice hard, sharp, daring him to rise. The man in row 17 opened his eyes slowly, his gaze lifted, not rushed, not defensive, deliberate, like the drawing of a curtain. His eyes met the officers across the cabin. Silence fell. Even the clinking cartwheels stopped. The black man didn't speak. He only looked. A quiet, steady look that carried more weight than 1,000 words. His lips pressed together, his chin lifted slightly. That was all. The officer's smirk faltered, if only for a second. He quickly looked away, muttering under his breath. "Yeah, thought so." The young attendant, the one with tired eyes, paused by the black man's row. She leaned down gently. "Something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough for him to notice. He shook his head politely. "No, thank you." The way he said it, calm, grounded, forced her to swallow hard. She wanted to say more, to apologize, to acknowledge the wrong carved into the air. But fear sealed her lips again. She pushed the cart forward. Behind her, passengers exchanged subtle nods, almost unspoken agreements forming between strangers. The injustice they had witnessed wasn't leaving them. It clung like static in the air. One passenger whispered, "Someone's recording this, right?" Another answered, "I already am." The officer heard that. His stomach dropped, though his expression stayed tight. Cameras, phones raised silently in the dim light, had become new mirrors, reflecting arrogance into the world beyond these walls. His badge suddenly felt heavier, not like protection, but like a chain pulling him down. The black man finally shifted in his seat, just slightly, leaning closer to the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, outlined by the sunset fading into night. His face was calm, but inside thoughts surged. He wasn't just a passenger anymore, not to them, not to the world beyond the phone screens. He was a symbol, and the officer, unknowingly, had already begun writing his own downfall. One action, one cruel display at a time. The hum of the engines continued, steady, unrelenting, as though carrying the weight of something larger than the plane itself. The stage had been set. The whispers were growing louder, and somewhere, beyond the sealed cabin, millions would soon hear the truth. The plane's cabin hummed with that strange mix of artificial calm and unspoken tension. The overhead lights glowed faintly golden, reflecting off the polished tops of the luggage compartments, while below, human voices rose and fell in nervous undertones. Phones tilted at subtle angles. Screens glowed faintly as passengers who'd once turned away now became silent witnesses. The college student in row 20 adjusted his sleeve to hide the lens of his phone. He didn't want to look obvious, but his pulse quickened. His thumb trembled as it tapped record. Every moment felt heavier now, not just seen but preserved. 2 rows behind him, an older woman with gray hair folded her hands around her phone like it was a prayer. She whispered to the man beside her, "This needs to be seen. No one would believe it otherwise." The officer 3 rows ahead felt it. He didn't see the cameras directly, but the weight of being watched prickled across his skin like static. He shifted in his seat, straightening his back, pretending to stretch. His eyes darted to the corners of the cabin. Pathetic, he muttered under his breath, though the word came out shakier than before. He reached for his belt instinctively, fingers brushing against the cool steel of his badge clipped to his hip, as if its presence alone was enough to remind him who he was, who he thought he was. The badge glinted briefly in the dim cabin light, a symbol he had always trusted, a shield he believed placed him above judgment. But here, now, every gleam felt like exposure. The black man sat unmoving in row 17. His head rested slightly back, eyes closed, as though this cramped metal tube at 30,000 feet was a sanctuary rather than a prison. His breathing was steady, almost meditative. He hadn't said a word since being shoved back into his seat, but silence itself was powerful. It wasn't submission. It wasn't defeat. It was resistance in its purest form, unyielding calm against reckless arrogance. And it drove the officer mad. He slammed his tray table open suddenly, the clatter startling those around him. He leaned across the aisle, his voice slicing the hush. "You all think you know what's happening here?" he snapped, scanning the rows with accusing eyes. "You think he's some victim? You've got no idea what men like him are capable of." The businessman from earlier shifted uncomfortably. "All we saw was you dragging a man," he said quietly. The officer's head whipped toward him. "Excuse me?" The man's voice faltered, but he didn't retract. "That's what everyone saw." A ripple of unease spread. More phones lifted discreetly. The officer's pulse thundered. He licked his lips, suddenly aware of his own breathing. Too loud, too uneven. He turned his glare back toward the black man. "Say something," he barked. "Tell them why I had to act. Tell them." But the man did not open his eyes. He only lifted one hand slowly, resting it over his heart for a moment, then letting it fall again. A gesture so subtle, so calm, it sent chills across the cabin. It was as if he were saying, "My dignity is intact. Yours is not." The officer slammed his tray table shut again. His hands twitched against his knees. He tried to steady himself, but every whisper around him felt like a verdict already cast. The young attendant passed again, this time stopping near row 17. She crouched low, pretending to check the seatbelt sign, and whispered, "Are you okay?" The man opened his eyes briefly, nodded once, and replied, "I've been through worse." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried through the tense silence like thunder. The attendant's throat tightened. She stood quickly, blinking back tears, and moved away. The officer clenched his fists. "Through worse," he repeated mockingly, though his voice cracked. He looked down the aisle again, and this time he saw them. The phones, the glowing dots of cameras capturing every twitch of his face. His chest tightened. For the first time in years, the badge at his side didn't feel like protection. It felt like a ticking bomb strapped to his waist. Still, he leaned back, forcing a smirk that fooled no one. "Let them record," he muttered under his breath. "The world needs to see who's really in charge." But deep down, beneath the mask, he felt the first crack of fear spreading. A fear that the world wouldn't see power, only cruelty. And cruelty, once lit on camera, could not be unseen. The engines roared steadily outside, carrying them forward. Every mile higher, every second closer, the weight of exposure grew heavier. And in that quiet cabin, the balance of power had already begun to shift. Not with fists, not with force, but with silent recordings and unbroken dignity. The engines hummed steadily, a low thunder in the metal belly of the plane. But inside, it wasn't the engines that consumed everyone's attention. It was the officer, fidgeting in row 14, his every movement a performance staged for an unwilling audience. His hand drifted again to the polished metal at his hip. He unclipped the badge from his belt and placed it flat on the tray table before him. The dull light above glinted off its surface, scattering gold reflections across his fingers. "There it is," he said loudly, lifting his chin. "The reason this plane is safe. The reason you're safe. Because people like me wear this with pride." Passengers turned toward the gleam, some eyes narrowing, others hollow with unease. The businessman from earlier muttered, "That badge isn't pride anymore." The officer's head snapped around. "Excuse me?" The man met his glare with trembling but steady eyes. "It's just metal. It doesn't make cruelty right." The words hung in the air, raw and sharp. The officer chuckled coldly, though it sounded more like a cough. He lifted the badge higher, tilting it for all to see. "This isn't just metal. It's authority. It's sacrifice. Without it, you'd all be lost." But the murmurs around him were no longer whispers. They were ripples of doubt, questions breaking the surface. Authority doesn't mean abuse. Sacrifice for who? Safe for some, not for others. The officer's pulse raced. He slammed the badge back onto the tray, the clang loud in the cabin. "You think you know what this means? None of you do. You don't understand what it takes to wear this." And then, for the first time, the black man moved. He sat forward slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. The cabin seemed to lean with him, silence falling thick, even the whir of the vents fading in the background. His voice came calm even, but it carried the weight of stone. "I wore one like it," he said. The officer froze. His smirk faltered. "What did you say?" The man didn't repeat himself. He just leaned back again, crossing his arms, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if it alone understood his patience. Passengers gasped quietly. A ripple of electricity surged through the rows. Those with phones gripped them tighter, their recording suddenly more valuable than gold. The officer blinked, confusion mingling with anger. He forced a laugh, mocking, desperate. "You don't make me laugh. Men like you." But he cut himself short. His words dangled, unfinished, as he caught the stares of those around him. Stares that no longer saw him as protector, but as predator. The young attendant paused at the officer's row, her tray clinking nervously. "Sir," she said cautiously, "maybe it's best to put the badge away." The officer sneered. "Stay out of this." But even his voice lacked the force it had earlier. It cracked, splintered under the weight of doubt now pressing from every side. The black man shifted again, finally turning his gaze toward the badge resting on the tray. His eyes lingered there for a long moment, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with something heavier. Sadness. The sight of it unsettled the officer more than shouting ever could. He reached for the badge quickly, as though needing to protect it from that gaze, from that quiet judgment. He clutched it to his chest. "This is mine," he muttered. "Mine," the older woman in the back whispered. "Not for long." It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be, but it carried, slipping between rows, seating itself in every mind that heard. The officer straightened, gripping the badge tighter, as though trying to fuse it with his own skin. But even he couldn't shake the feeling growing in his gut, that for the first time, the badge no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the eyes recording him. It belonged to the whispers spreading like fire. It belonged to the truth, waiting, inevitable. And deep inside, a fear gnawed. What if this flight didn't land the way he imagined? What if this wasn't just a confrontation in the cabin, but the beginning of something far larger? The badge gleamed once more, but now it looked less like authority and more like a mirror, reflecting back his arrogance for all to see. The black man closed his eyes again, exhaling slowly. His calm was louder than shouting. His silence was heavier than chains. And the officer, clutching his symbol of power, couldn't escape the gnawing thought. Maybe authority wasn't his anymore. Maybe it never truly was. The plane rocked gently as it cut through a thin band of turbulence, overhead bins rattling slightly. But inside, it wasn't the bump that made passengers grip their armrests tighter. It was the sound of a man losing control. The officer's breathing had grown shallow, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins along his neck pulsed. He rubbed the edge of his badge with his thumb, as though polishing away doubt could restore its shine. But every time he looked up, all he saw were eyes, rows of them watching, recording, silently judging. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped suddenly, his voice breaking the hush. "You people don't understand the weight I carry. You don't know what it takes to protect this country." From the back, the older woman with gray hair spoke softly but firmly. "Protection doesn't look like dragging an innocent man." The officer turned, rage flashing. "You don't know anything about him!" Her eyes didn't flinch. "I know what I saw." Murmurs rippled. The air seemed thicker, the tension denser. The black man, still in row 17, shifted slightly. His hands rested calmly on his lap, his breathing steady. Not once had he raised his voice, and yet the cabin leaned toward him, drawn to the quiet gravity of his presence. A young man across the aisle couldn't hold it anymore. "Sir," he said loudly to the officer, "if you're so confident, why are you so afraid of people recording?" Gasps followed. The officer's head snapped toward him, face reddening. "I'm not afraid," he barked, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as he shoved the badge back onto his belt. "I just don't want lies spreading about what happened here." The college student, still recording discreetly, whispered to himself, "The only lies are the ones he tells." The flight attendant, the young one with tired eyes, gathered her courage. She stepped forward into the aisle, her voice shaking but audible. "Maybe it's best if we all calm down. No one needs to prove authority here." But her attempt at peace only made the silence sharper. Authority was already being tested. The officer leaned back, stretching out again as if to claim the row. His smirk tried to return, but cracks split through it like fractures in glass. "You'll all thank me one day," he said bitterly, "when you realize men like me keep the chaos away." The black man finally opened his eyes again. He turned his head slightly, enough to meet the officer's gaze. His voice came slow, deliberate, each word anchored. "Chaos doesn't come from people like me." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "It comes from people who think they own the sky." A hush blanketed the cabin. Even the hum of the engine seemed quieter for a moment. The officer's lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened, as though the calmness of that voice had stolen his own. He shifted in his seat, sweating beneath the uniform he once wore like armor. The badge at his hip felt heavier now, pressing into his skin, reminding him not of power but of the eyes, the cameras, the whispers, the judgment. Passengers leaned closer to one another. One whispered, "He's losing it." Another answered, "He already has." The officer ran a hand over his face, dragging his palm down as though he could erase the tension. He muttered to himself, words spilling too low for anyone to catch fully, except fragments. "Don't let them win. They don't understand. I'm in control." But even he didn't believe it anymore. The black man looked away again, back toward the window, his reflection faint in the glass. He didn't need to speak further. The silence spoke for him. And for the first time, the officer realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't his stage anymore. The cabin wasn't his audience. The badge wasn't his shield. It was his trial, and the cracks in his uniform had begun to show. The morning after the incident, America woke to a new storm. Screens across every major network lit up with the same haunting footage. The moment Officer Blake's arrogance crumbled under the relentless eye of truth. His badge being ripped from his chest had become an unforgettable symbol, replayed endlessly with captions screaming, "Justice served on live TV." Talk show hosts debated the event. Anchors dissected it and hashtags exploded online. Words like accountability, racism, and police abuse of power trended, threading across millions of voices. Some called it a turning point, others, a reckoning long overdue. At the heart of it all, the black man who had been dragged from the plane sat quietly in a modest hotel room provided by civil rights advocates. His name, finally revealed, Marcus Reed. Reporters swarmed outside, but Marcus had said nothing since the incident. That silence, however, only made the anticipation grow. Everyone wanted to know. What would he say? That afternoon, Marcus appeared before the cameras. He wore a simple navy suit, his posture steady but his eyes heavy with the weight of what he had endured. The room hushed. "I didn't choose for this to happen," Marcus began, his voice calm, deliberate. "I didn't ask to be dragged, humiliated, treated like less than human. But maybe..." He paused, scanning the sea of microphones. "Maybe it needed to happen in front of all of you, for the world to finally see what so many of us live through quietly every day." The silence was profound. Even the reporter's pen stopped scratching. "I'm not here to demand revenge. I'm here to demand change." For every voice silenced, For every badge abused, for every life dismissed because of the color of their skin. His voice sharpened, carrying through the speakers. Let this not be just a headline. Let it be a beginning. Applause erupted, raw and unfiltered. His words weren't grandiose, but they cut deep, igniting a spark that resonated beyond that press room. Meanwhile, Officer Blake sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. His phone buzzed with calls he didn't answer. His social media accounts overflowed with fury, his face plastered on news reports with words like disgraced, racist, and terminated. He turned on the TV, only to see Marcus's speech airing live. The sight of the man he had tried to humiliate now commanding the nation's attention gnawed at him. The tables had turned, and not quietly. Worse still, whispers of federal investigations began to surface. Old complaints he thought buried were being reopened. Cases dismissed under his watch were being re-examined. The ripple effect of his arrogance was dismantling not just his career, but the institution that had shielded him for years. Protests swelled outside airports. Signs reading, "We are Marcus. No more silence." Badges don't excuse racism. Families marched. Veterans marched. Even pilots and flight attendants joined, demanding better protections for passengers against abuse of power. For Marcus, it wasn't about fame or recognition. As he walked away from the press conference, he told his lawyer softly, "I just want to breathe in peace again." But the tide was moving, and the world had no intention of letting this moment slip into the shadows. The ripple effect had begun. The footage of Blake's badge hitting the ground had not only gone viral, it had forced doors, open that had been locked for years. News outlets dug deeper. Files long buried under internal review suddenly saw daylight. The public learned of at least 12 complaints filed against Blake over the past decade. Allegations of excessive force, racial slurs, unjustified arrests. Each case, neatly dismissed, painted the portrait of a man shielded by a system designed to protect him, not the people he swore to serve. Now that armor was cracking. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation. The words civil rights violations echoed across the nation like a bell toll. Blake's former colleagues who once joked beside him now avoided his calls. His precinct released a cold, calculated statement. The actions of Officer Blake do not reflect the values of this department. He stared at those words on the screen, his jaw clenched. For years he had walked with the arrogance of untouchability. Now those same walls were caving in on him. Meanwhile, Marcus's life transformed overnight. Once just another passenger flying home, he had become a symbol, unwilling but undeniable. Activists reached out. Churches invited him to speak. Universities asked him to share his experience. But Marcus remained careful. He knew symbols could be used, twisted, even destroyed. Sitting in his hotel room one evening, he told his lawyer, "I don't want to be a puppet for anyone's agenda. This isn't about me being famous. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." His lawyer nodded, and that's exactly why they're listening. Because you're not chasing the spotlight. You're chasing justice. Still, the weight pressed on him. Each new headline carried his name. Each new protest chanted it. He couldn't walk the street without people stopping him, thanking him, crying in front of him. He bore their pain with quiet dignity. But at night, when the cameras were gone, he sat alone, wondering if he was strong enough to carry it. Blake, on the other hand, spiraled. News crews camped outside his home. Anonymous letters slipped under his door, his voicemail filled with hate, threats, and disappointment. The one time he tried to walk into a grocery store, whispers followed him until someone spat near his feet. The once proud officer who strutted in uniform now found himself shrinking into hoodies and shadows. His arrogance, once fuel, had become his undoing, and then came the blow he didn't expect. His wife, tired of the spotlight, the shame, the endless reporters, packed a suitcase. Blake's voice broke as he tried to stop her. "You don't understand," he shouted. "They're making me a monster." "They don't know the truth!" She turned, her face cold. "No, Blake, they know exactly who you are. I just didn't want to see it." The door shut with a finality that left the house echoing in silence. Meanwhile, Marcus stood at a podium at a community center, facing a crowd of young men and women. His voice, steady but filled with conviction, carried through the hall. "You are not powerless," he told them. "They want you to believe your voice doesn't matter. But what happened on that plane proves otherwise. Every injustice revealed, every voice raised, every truth spoken, it ripples. And those ripples can move mountains." The room erupted in applause. Cameras captured every moment. His words, replayed across news stations, painted him not as a victim, but as a leader. The contrast was undeniable. One man's arrogance had unraveled a corrupt system. Another man's dignity had sparked a movement. Blake poured another glass of whiskey that night, watching Marcus on TV. His hands trembled. For the first time in his life, he realized the badge hadn't made him powerful. It had made him blind. And now, with the world watching, there was no shield left to hide behind. The room was filled with cameras. Bright lights cut across the oak-paneled hearing chamber where the Civil Rights Commission convened. Rows of journalists sat with pens poised, waiting for history to unfold. At the center of it all sat Marcus. No uniform, no badge, no power to hide behind, just a man with truth on his side. His suit was simple, his posture straight, but his presence filled the room. Across from him sat Officer Blake, dressed in a crumpled gray suit, sweat already darkening his collar. The once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by restless hands gripping the edge of the table. The chairwoman adjusted her microphone. "Mr. Marcus, you may begin." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "I was dragged off that plane because of the color of my skin. Not because of a crime, not because of a threat. Because I existed where he didn't want me to exist." Gasps rippled through the room. Blake shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously toward the cameras. Marcus continued. But what he didn't expect was that the world was watching. He thought the badge made him untouchable. But dignity can't be dragged down an aisle. Truth doesn't lose when it's broadcast. The chairwoman nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus." Then it was Blake's turn. His lawyer pushed him forward, whispering furiously. Blake cleared his throat, tried to summon the voice that once barked orders with authority. "It wasn't about race," he stammered. He was being disruptive. "I followed protocol." The chairwoman cut in sharply. "Protocol does not explain the use of racial slurs, nor does it explain the excessive force. Multiple eyewitnesses, and the footage itself, say otherwise." The footage played on the screen above them. Blake's voice echoed. "People like you don't belong here." Every word replayed like a hammer striking a coffin. Blake's face turned pale under the relentless light. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands, watching the truth do the work. The chairwoman's voice grew sharper. "Officer Blake, do you deny that this is your voice?" Silence. "Do you deny that this is your hand dragging him down the aisle?" Silence again. The room's energy shifted. The people weren't looking at Marcus anymore. They were staring at Blake, the man stripped of every ounce of credibility. Finally, Blake muttered, "No, I can't deny it." The admission was louder than any scream. Reporters scribbled furiously. Headlines were being born in that moment. The chairwoman's gavel struck. "Let it be recorded that Officer Blake admits to the actions in question. Further disciplinary and legal proceedings will be determined." The cameras zoomed in on Marcus as he stood. His expression was calm, almost serene. He turned slightly, just enough for the audience and the millions watching at home to hear. "You see, the badge doesn't make the man. The truth does. And tonight, the truth belongs to everyone who has ever been silenced." Applause broke out, hesitant at first. Then rolling like thunder, Blake sank into his chair, his career shredded not just by official papers, but by the court of public opinion. He knew it was over. He knew that wherever he went, his face would follow him, his words would haunt him. Meanwhile, Marcus walked out of the chamber to flashing cameras and raised fists of support. For the first time since that flight, he felt lighter, not victorious, because no one wins when injustice happens, but vindicated. On live TV, in front of the world, the balance had shifted. The city was alive with noise. Streets once silent now echoed with chants, murals, and signs carrying Marcus's name. It wasn't fame he wanted, but it was a testament that dignity could not be dragged down an airplane aisle. When Marcus stepped off the courthouse steps, he was greeted not with cameras alone, but with people. Mothers clutching their children. Veterans in uniform. Teenagers raising their fists in solidarity. One elderly woman reached for his hand, tears in her eyes. "You stood for all of us, son." "Thank you." Marcus squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady. "No, ma'am. I just refused to sit down when they told me I didn't belong. The rest? That's all of us together." Meanwhile, Blake's world had collapsed into ashes. His badge had already been stripped. The department issued a formal statement of termination. His bank account was drained by legal fees. His name became a curse whispered in households across the nation. He sat in a dimly lit bar, alone, the TV above him replaying the moment his badge hit the ground. No one came to sit beside him. No one offered comfort. For the first time in his life, Blake truly understood isolation. The man who once strutted with authority now shrank into shadows, forgotten by the system he once thought invincible. But Marcus's journey was far from ending. Weeks later, he received an invitation, a veterans recognition ceremony at the state capitol. He almost declined, weary of the cameras, wary of being a symbol, but something in him knew it mattered. He stood on the stage, modest in a simple dark suit, as officials listed his service record. His years in uniform, his quiet sacrifices, his dignity in the face of humiliation. And then it happened. A 4-star general decorated in ribbons and medals walked slowly across the stage. The crowd hushed. Cameras zoomed in. The general stopped in front of Marcus, heels clicking together, and with the weight of the nation watching, he raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. The air stilled. This wasn't a courtesy. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect, given from the highest uniform to the man who had been dragged like nothing on a plane. Tears welled in Marcus's eyes, but he stood tall, returning the salute with a hand that didn't shake. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the hall. Reporters captured the image that would circle the globe, not of Marcus on the floor of an airplane, but of Marcus standing proud, saluted as a man of dignity and honor. After the ceremony, a young boy tugged at Marcus's sleeve. "Mister," he said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Marcus knelt, meeting the boy's eyes. "Be better than me. Be braver, kinder, stronger, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong." The boy nodded, eyes shining. That night, Marcus sat quietly on his porch, finally alone, finally at peace. The city still roared with his name, but in that quiet moment he didn't think of cameras, protests, or trials. He thought of the simple truth: dignity, once defended, cannot be taken away. And though the story of that plane ride had ended, a greater story had begun. One not about a badge destroyed, but about a nation waking up. Because justice is not one man's victory, it is everyone's responsibility.